Welcome to the Peer Perspective Podcast, where we dive into real stories of recovery, resilience, and hope. I'm your host, Kyle Van Blaricum, and today we have an incredible journey to share with you. But before we begin, if you know anyone who might be inspired by today's message, please take a moment to share the podcast with them. Your support helps us reach more people who need to hear these powerful stories. Let's get started. I'm incredibly honored to introduce our next guest, Beth Walters. Beth is the Peer Development Manager for NAMI of Sarasota and Manatee counties in Florida, where she's a dedicated and passionate peer supervisor, supporting others on their recovery journeys. Beth describes herself as someone who lives on the spectrum of suicidality, and her journey has been nothing short of inspiring. Her vulnerability and willingness to share her personal ups and downs truly shines through. She's a beacon of light to those around her, and I am so grateful that she agreed to sit down with me for this conversation. I know her story will resonate with so many of you. So, without further ado, let's dive into today's episode. Beth, again, I appreciate your willingness to join me here today and share a little bit about your experience. And you're a peer supporter or a peer supervisor. Do I understand that correct?
Both.
Okay.
I identify with both. But
Okay.
yes, I'm a supervisor right now.
Okay. So, yeah, I mean, if you want to give us a little bit of your story and kind of what led you to get into peer support.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I just want to say first, thank you so much for having me. I'm actually really excited. It's always been like on my bucket list to do a podcast. And I think this is really cool and just love spreading the message of peer support and getting word out there about that we're here and what we do. And so, yeah, just wanted to say that first. So my story, where do I start? So, I'm originally from Long Island, New York, and I'm the oldest of 7 kids. So I think being the oldest of a large family, I felt a lot of responsibility that just kind of naturally came with being the oldest child. And I started really struggling probably when I was 12 or 13. I think I was always just an anxious kid. I remember I used to say to my mom that my stomach hurt on Sunday nights before school, and she thought I was just saying that because I didn't want to go to school, but my stomach actually hurt. And I look back at that now and I'm like, oh, that was anxiety. And so then when I was a teenager, I really started to just feel really disconnected from life. And I didn't really have too many friends growing up. I had a couple, but like I had imaginary friends. My toys were my friends. And so when I was 12, 13, I started struggling with self-harm as a way to just kind of cope with all of my sadness. And well, I guess I'll get to this part first. But when I was 14, a couple of things happened. I went to a circus, and I just describe it as love at first sight. And I went to a Ringling Brothers show, and I fell in love with clowns, and I felt this like huge connection to clowning. And it was just a parallel at that time because I was very depressed and became suicidal. I had a couple attempts, but here I am wanting to be a clown, and just I loved the connection that clowns brought. But I'll get into that in a little bit. So yeah, when I was 15, I had a pretty serious suicide attempt. And that was due to a couple of traumas, and I didn't really get along great with my parents growing up. It's funny, I look at like new diagnoses that come out, and I don't really identify so much with like the diagnoses language, especially in like peer support. But I definitely would speak up for myself a lot. And I was also raised Roman Catholic, so there was some religious, now what I look back at is like religious trauma there. And so when I was 15, I tried to take my life, and uh, I didn't really get help for about another year. I was actually in my church youth group, and we had a night that was based on To Write Love on Her Arms. And there were actually some other peers in the group. There were two peers in particular who spoke up and shared their story and shared that they had also struggled with self-harm and suicide attempts. And I just broke down that day and felt like, oh my gosh, I'm not the only one. Like, there's actually other people out there who deal with this, because I had a lot of shame. Excuse me, I had a lot of shame about my suicide attempts and depression, and just really low self-esteem, really hated myself. And so I ended up telling one of these peers about my suicide attempt a couple or like 10 months prior. And so the next day at school, he brought me to talk to a school social worker, and I pretty much word vomited and cried and shared everything I'd been struggling with, and that I had a suicide attempt that prior start of the school year. And then that social worker ended up calling my parents, and they said they had to take me to a hospital to get checked. And that was really traumatic. And it was the first and only time I was hospitalized, because after that experience, I was like, I never want to have that happen again. So that was like a little bit about like my teen years and just kind of the struggles.
It sounds like you almost had like a experience with peer support in that group, like when someone else shared something and you were like,
Mhm.
um, wow, that's
Yeah.
pretty
Yeah, I
cool.
look back at that now, and I find it so interesting just naturally where I ended up now here today. And I was like, wow, it's literally peer support, which is what then ended up after that experience. I had to see a therapist and a psychiatrist until I was 18. That's a whole nother story. But that's what helped link me to services at that time, was my peers. And I think it's just speaks organically to, when you are able to talk to someone who's been through it, that's literally what brought my shame walls down.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I think that that's so true, just having that someone, right? Someone to hear you or see you. Um,
Mm.
so you talked a little bit about your childhood. I have to say, when I was watching your TED Talk, and I know we'll get to that in a little bit here too, when you started out, it was such a like a deep conversation, and then you put that clown nose on it. I was like, okay, I like you.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Yeah, so I don't mean to interrupt you, but I just when you said
No,
so can you talk a little bit about when, well, you shared that you kind of had that experience sitting in that group, but can you talk about when you started your recovery or your healing process and how that's kind of looked for you?
yeah, definitely. So, in 2016, I was in college at that point, in my early 20s, and I had gone through a series of loss of friendships, that were really, really close. They were pretty much like sisters to me. And it was a group of four of us, and just kind of one by one, they ghosted me and left my life. And that kind of brought up a lot of stuff for me. And I was about to graduate college, and there's some other hard stuff going on in my life at that point. And I woke up one morning, and it was July 15th, 2016. And I woke up, and it was just like that sick and tired of being sick and tired. And I just felt like I can't keep going on like this. I can't keep living in this sense, in this depression, and um, just kind of where I was at. And so I was like, okay, something has to change. And I don't know what that is, but I didn't wake up at 6 a.m. and I didn't drink coffee. And so I was like, all right, those are the two changes we're going to start making. And so I woke up every single day for 3 years at 6 a.m. and I would have a cup of coffee and I would reflect for an hour. And that's how I started my day every single day. And I had no idea what that was going to do for me, but it really changed everything. Like it changed my whole perspective on life, my personal philosophy, my understanding of myself. Like I really got to know myself and find accountability in my experiences. And I remember hearing this saying in my early recovery of, your trauma is not your fault, but your healing is your responsibility. And that just like did something for me. And it really validated like, oh, okay, the things that I've gone through, they happened, and what I felt was valid, but now it's okay, am I going to continue to point to these things and just blame and say, this is why I am the way I am because of this thing and that thing? Or am I going to say, okay, it's time to do some hard work and get through this stuff? And that like personal responsibility changed a lot for me.
It's amazing. So fast forward a little bit. When did you start or get into the peer support field?
Yes. So peer support, I like to say I didn't find peer support, but peer support found me. Um, and in 2020, it was the pandemic, of course, and I've been living in Florida since 2019. But I moved back to New York during that time and then came back to Florida. And so I did Instacart and Uber Eats to pay my bills. I'm like, all right, gotta still pay my bills somehow. And after the summer of doing that, I was just like, okay, I need something that gives me meaning and purpose, being a past clown and pursuing communication and theater. Like I'm very purpose driven. And so I started looking for community-based jobs. And a job posting came up, and it was for a suicide prevention specialist, and it said lived experience with suicide preferred. I say that in my TED talk, but I was so shocked. I was like, is that correct? Like, does that say lived experience? Like, wow, I did not ever think that trying to kill myself would qualify for me for a job. And I was like, oh, I think this is for me. And so I applied, and I like to say now, like looking back at that it wasn't, trying to kill myself that got it. It was making the choice to live and to keep going and finding a
Yeah.
meaning. And that was my first role in peer support. I actually didn't even know it was a peer support job when I took it.
Yeah.
I didn't understand the correlation. And now doing peer support for 4 years, it goes so deep.
And if I remember correctly, you saw that ad during a pretty, I don't know, disappointing period, because didn't you just find out that the circus job was going to be coming to an end? Do I remember? Is that how it kind of?
So that it's part of it. So that
Okay,
was in
okay.
2020. The circus ended. So I joined the circus in 2017. It was right after I graduated college, and I had an 18-month contract. And then 3 days after I got there, Ringling made the announcement that they're, oh, sorry, that's my cats.
Oh, it's okay.
Ringling announced that they were going to be closing for good, and that I was going to have 5 months to do this. And
Oh.
that was, it was devastating and still is, but when I look back in retrospect, it was the craziest 5 months of emotions I've ever felt, because it was like the highest high of my life,
Yeah.
coming out of the portal in a clown nose.
So what was
And
that like? I mean, it's obviously I've been to a circus, but what's that like actually like being part of the circus?
Oh, it was so much fun. It was so cool. So I was in an alley. It's called Clown Alley. There were 12 of us. And I lived on a train for 5 months, and my room was like the size of a closet, like not even the size of a walk-in closet. And I loved living on the train. I always say, oh, I would sell my soul for one more train run, because going from city to city, you're in a different city every week. And you're on the train for a day or two as you don't stop as you're going to the next town. And we would have train parties, and or just sitting on the vestibule, like the between both cars, that it was open, and so you could sit out there. And just watch the world go by and have a cup of coffee, or just stay in your room. And sleep on a train is the best night of sleep you'll ever get.
Really?
Yeah,
I wouldn't
it
think
is.
that.
Yeah, just the rocking motion of it. But I
Sure.
loved living on the train, and I always like to say I've never felt more myself than with grease paint and a clown nose. And I really feel like clowning is what brought me to peer support, because clowning made me who I am and taught me about vulnerability, about taking risks, about just the art of play and authenticity, and really just being who you are and
Mhm.
not being ashamed of that, and connecting. Because clowns, we like to think as like, the jokesters, the humor, and that's part of it. But really, the core of clowning is how am I connecting?
Right.
And once I realized what peer support is and what it's all about, I felt like my purpose was back again, because I was searching for that from when the circus closed until I found peer support. And it's like I leveled up in purpose, if that makes
Yeah,
sense.
yeah, yeah. No, I think that that's awesome. And when you talk about your childhood and your experiences, and then to become a clown, I don't know. I just think it's pretty cool. You said you were an anxious kid, and then to get out there, and I don't know if I could do that. So yeah, I think that
I
that's
always like to
awesome.
say everyone has their own inner clown, but there's a clown to all of us.
So you're saying I should put a nose on and just see what happens? Maybe it'll come
Yeah,
off.
I wish I had my purse next to me, because I keep an emergency clown nose in my bag. Like everywhere I go, I have a clown nose on me, because you just never know when you need one.
Uh, that's awesome. Do you ever just like put it on like and not say anything to anybody? Like
I do. I've done that before at work. I'll just take it out and just like wait for someone to notice.
that's awesome. Um, so you shared a little bit about kind of your experiences leading up to, getting into the field. Um, what was it like to do a TED Talk?
Oh, it was really cool. So that was actually also one of my bucket list dreams. And I
Yeah.
remember years and years ago, because I've been captivated by TED, just the TED platform, really since I was a teenager.
Mm.
And um, I remember saying, oh, I would love to give a TED talk one day. Like I have no idea what I would give it on or how that would happen, but universe, I'd love to give a TED talk. And um, I went through an application process. You had to write a 500-page Word application. You had to go through an interview round, and different selection processes. And I was one of, well, 15 of us were chosen. I forget how many applicants were there. There were, I think, a couple hundred maybe. Um, and I was selected, and I was so surprised and shocked. And I was like, oh, wow, this is like actually happening. I have to do this now, because I don't know. I was like, okay, yeah, like I'll do this. That's fine. And I was like, wow, I guess my delusions came true.
Was it nerve-wracking?
It wasn't all at once. So I went to school for communication studies, and I
Sure.
went for theater as well. And so I had to do a lot of public speaking in
Yeah.
college, and just throughout different jobs and things like that. And so it was really exciting, but really nerve-wracking. And I had to write out my whole script and then memorize the script and then rehearse it. And so it was
Hmm.
very much practiced.
Yeah. Well, it was fantastic. Like I said, when Sonia had given us your name, and that was the first thing we pulled up, and I was like, this is awesome. So
Oh,
we were really
awesome.
excited. Um,
Thank you.
yeah. So can you share a little bit about the organization you work for, and the work that you do now with in the peer support field?
Yeah, sure. So I actually find it ironic, because at the end of my TED talk, I
Mhm.
referenced NAMI as a peer organization, and now I currently work for them. So that was not planned. It was just one of those universal happenstance things that an opportunity presented itself. And so now I work for my local county NAMI affiliate, and NAMI stands for National Alliance on Mental Illness. And I really enjoy it because of the peer culture, excuse me, of the peer culture that we have in our organization. So I have worked for a clinical organization before as well. And there is a noticeable difference being in an organization that is all peers. So I think that's what I really enjoy about NAMI. And so as an organization, we provide support, education, advocacy, help to anyone who's affected by or lives with a mental health condition. So adults, youth, families, and all of our programs are provided at no cost to anyone who participates in them. So I also really love that about our organization, because I think reducing barriers to access is really important. So I do feel grateful that, that's also part of our organizational culture.
That's awesome. I know, you know, I can speak from my own experience as a peer. We work with a lot of people who have a variety of different, mental health challenges, substance use. With your lived experience, does that necessarily limit you from the people that you work with, or do you only work with people with similar background, or how does that work?
Yeah, it doesn't really limit me in any context,
Okay.
as far as like my current role or even what we do. Um, I feel like sometimes we get into these like silos or boxes of like mental
Right.
health is over here and substance is over here and this other thing is over there. And one thing I really love about peer support is kind of breaking down those walls and silos. And I think our organization doesn't necessarily, well, it doesn't say, okay, what's your diagnosis? Do you fit
Right.
over here, over
Yeah.
there? And, there's program requirements, which makes sense of like, is this, the right program to fit your need? But as far as I think connecting or how I show up in like my role or when I'm doing peer support with someone, um, I don't think it limits me in like the connections I can create
Right. Right.
or be a part of.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree. I think that in every other system, you're kind of sorted into those groups, right? Like, oh, I have a substance use issue, or mental health, and it really is it's all the same, right? So focusing on what we have in common, right? I can relate to a lot of people's situations in a lot of different ways, and so focusing on that stuff, I think that's really, you know, the amazing thing about peer support. So that's awesome.
Yeah. Yeah, I was just having a conversation yesterday with a couple of my peers and colleagues about, in peer support, how it can definitely be helpful to talk to someone with that very same similar, lived experience because of any just like unspoken things or nuances that come with it, but how we can also really connect on a deeper level, because if we peel back the onion and maybe the context surrounding some things, it's like the feelings that we can relate to.
Right.
uh, like maybe my story or my context is different over here, but under that I felt shame. And did someone else's story, did they also feel that? And being able to
Yeah.
relate like in that sense.
It's awesome. Um, so can you share a success story with us, either your own or with maybe an individual that you've worked with?
Gosh. Hmm. Well, the first one that really always comes up for me is someone who I worked with um, when I was in my first year of peer support doing suicide prevention. And when I started meeting with this individual, she was really, really not doing well. Had just got out of the hospital for suicidal ideation and had a lot of just kind of things going on in her life that was causing a lot of deep despair and struggle. And I would meet with her every single week. And, it took some time to really find that hope, but really just being able to show up for her and be there and listen non-judgmentally and, share some of my own experience. the fact that she would also show up every week said something to me that, okay, maybe we're, you know, kind of having similar conversations week to week, but you're showing up, so something is coming from this. And so we met every single week for a year, and by the end of that year, so much had changed. She was able to get an income. She had reunited or not reunited, rekindled her relationship with her daughter. She had self-esteem, she had hope, and, you know, all out of showing up at her house once a week for a year and connecting. And so I always think of her in this situation because we were also very different. So we were different age demographics, we had different outlooks and opinions, and, you know, still through those differences as well, we really formed a very connected bond. And I remember when we had to end our meetings that she was like, oh, please, like, wait, not yet. And I was like, okay, like a couple more weeks. Cause honestly, I didn't really want to either, because I really enjoyed just talking with her every week. So really just seeing like the light come back in her eyes, I think it's just what I always think of.
Yeah, we have this amazing front row seat to see, you know, these successes play out in people's lives, and it's a pretty amazing and inspiring, you know, place to be. So I did want to kind of I guess ask, like, and this is mostly to kind of outline maybe the difference between someone in a clinical role and a peer support. But let's say someone is really struggling and they are thinking about ending their life, and they come to you with that information. What does that look like?
Well, I think the first thing I, you know, really ask is just tell me more, like tell me more about those feelings. And I think especially when it comes to suicide prevention and just kind of the experience of being suicidal is so individual and nuanced. And I think sometimes there's an automatic fear response that comes from us or people, you know, when we hear that. And traditionally, you know, the response is, okay, hospitalization. And through research and through, you know, my own personal experience, that's not often the best answer, or maybe what a person needs in that moment. And so I think, you know, for me, it's just, there's no fear that comes up. And I'll share my own experience with them and just really like holding the space for it, because as someone, I describe myself as I live on a spectrum of suicidality, and it's been that way since I was a teenager. And some days I'm connected to life and some days I'm not, and some days it's really intense. And you know, I think to be able to have someone, you know, I know in my own life I have someone who I can talk to about these things, and it's just free of judgment, and they hold the space and they talk about it. And you know, we kind of share our own experiences. And so really just showing up in that same way for someone to hold the space to say, yeah, I think that maybe I'd be better off not here, and not trying to shame them or say, oh no, like tell them how to have an experience, but to be in that experience with them.
And I just think about like having that safe person in your life who, you know, isn't gonna, I don't know, involve law enforcement or whatever. And I think in so many situations, you're right, we're so quick to jump to that, right? And um yeah, when people just want to be heard in that moment a lot of times, right?
Yeah.
That's awesome. um can you share some barriers or challenges that you see either in your organization or in the field as a whole?
Yes, I can, Kyle. So I am very, very passionate about peers being peers, not peers doing assessments, not peers falling into a case management role or a pseudo clinician. and the education of peer support, I think of people who supervise peers is a challenge. I know of so many people who come to me, and currently in my role, I oversee a certification, our peer training program, which is for assistance with the certification process, and we do the training and all that. And the feedback that I get of, hey, why am I doing a biopsychosocial? Or, oh, I'm doing a drug test, and it's like we are completely compromising the peer relationship here because we're setting up a power dynamic, and I don't think that's talked about enough. Of letting peers be peers, not admin assistants or all the other things that they're put into. So I think role drift is a really big challenge. And just really staying true to the root of peer support, which is the relationship and the connection. And I think sometimes in traditional services, there's this pressure to get the person to change, and like what rate are they changing, and the assessments that assess that. And okay, the rhetoric I remember saying to, being trained to say to a client, okay, my role is that so you don't need me anymore. And I've thought about that, and it's kind of to rush someone, or maybe not rush, but get them through services. And I think then when our focus is how quickly are you going through this program, or how can we get you, to move along, that we're losing the essence of the real focus, which is the relationship. And so I think we need to stay focused on the relationship that we're having rather than, all the other things that come with systems.
Yeah, I mean, I think role drift is a real thing. I've experienced it in my own. So, I think when we're working in these different systems, it's really easy to get sucked in, to case management or whatever. And so I would agree with you.
Yeah. Yeah, and
That's
I think also, oh, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was gonna say, I think also, really having the education of where we started from, that, when I came into peer support, I didn't realize that this was a whole movement, that this was something that started in the 1970s from the civil
Right,
rights era, and that there's a whole entire history of
right.
why we even have this in a model of care at all. And I
Mhm.
think when we are not recognizing our origins, we're moving away from, the true meaning and why peer support was created. It's not about saying, okay, I've accepted my diagnosis and my illness, and so let me help you accept yours.
Right.
And I think that's the narrative in the medical model of care, but it's how are we redefining our stories? How are we, questioning who told us that were these things, or why do I have to, it's really about being curious and changing the narrative that we have in our society. And I think that is something that we need to remember, so that we're, leaning into building peer support how it was intended.
Absolutely. Where do you see the peer support going, or what do you see the future of peer support being?
I think about this very often, being that part of my role is helping grow this workforce. And yeah, I think there's some pros and cons to it, as far as how it's being done, because it is growing. It's a movement that is growing and expanding, and I see the value in peers so much. And so I do think it's going to expand and grow. And I think we also then need to compensate our peers with a livable wage as it's growing. And yeah, just make sure to have the proper education in place, because it's growing so rapidly that we don't want to get, like I was saying, we don't want to get away from that true essence. So I think with the pace or the speed that it's growing, making sure that we're doing ethical peer support.
Yeah, absolutely. I know, I've been to a few conferences this year, and it seems like everywhere you go, they're talking about peer support. And so,
Mhm.
I'm fairly new to this. I've been doing it a little over a year now.
Awesome.
I did the training, I never really thought that I would use it, right? But just to see, like, you go to the hospital or you go to the courthouse or you go to human services, and there's all these different organizations out there offering peer support. I mean, I really think that it's a cool thing, and it's
Mhm.
really in some ways reducing the stigma, associated with mental health and substances, right?
Yeah.
So it's just a lot of amazing work. NAMI and the organization that you work for, it sounds like you guys are doing some amazing things down there in Florida. Um,
Mhm.
Beth, I want to give you kind of the last opportunity here if you have any final words or, anything else you wanted to share.
Yeah, I think, as peer support is growing, I think a lot about the lived experience narrative and how it's showing up and like being used in the role. And what I mean by that is having lived experience isn't just what makes us a peer, if that makes sense.
Sure.
I could be a case manager with lived experience. I could be a doctor with lived experience. I could be a basketball player with lived experience. But if we're not doing the discipline of peer support,
Mhm.
then our lived experience isn't um I don't know. Am I making sense? Like,
Yeah, we're
uh,
just essentially someone working as a case manager that doesn't have good boundaries, right?
right. Yeah. And like, I think that sometimes that narrative of lived experience gets heard and then roles are filled in a sense of like, oh, well, I have lived experience. I can do this thing. And then it just becomes more role drift. And
Right,
that lived experience is an aspect of peer support, but doing peer support and how we are exploring, worldviews and power dynamics and um, using empowerment and doing with, not for that. I
right,
think that is something that we want to, just keep in mind as peers as peer support is expanding, that yes, lived experience is a component of peer support, but also if I have lived experience and then I'm doing case management, am I really doing peer support?
right, right. Yeah, and you like we said, it's easy to get into that role drift, but I think it's so important to really know what your role is on that team, and it takes practice. It takes using skills. You have to, like,
Right.
I mean, I have to practice that every day because I
Mhm.
like to help people and I like to sometimes fix
Mhm.
people, right? So
Yeah, and it's well
you
intentioned.
it's always, yeah, it comes from a good place, but
Right.
and the other thing too is just having more than one peer on a team too, I think is so important. I actually just heard a story about somebody who is at a hospital, a psychiatric, like a state hospital that we have, and they're working there by themselves, no other peers, no. So I just, I
Yeah,
hear about
that's
situations like that, and it's just not good,
yeah, it becomes so isolating, and then it's like you're the token of like, okay, here's the peer, and it's like, well, we need community. That's literally what we're doing with peer support is we're building
right,
community and connection.
right,
So we
right,
should have, peers for peers. Um, and yeah, and even I think something to think about and consider, from like a provider aspect is we are investing in the peer workforce when we're providing ethical peer support or
right.
how we're providing our services, because I was once one of those people who was going to an agency and completely hopeless, and now I'm here and have my own lived experience and connecting with others. And I think keeping in mind the the person first rather than like
Right.
the diagnoses or the illness. And I think I would also just say to anyone who's interested in pursuing peer support, I would definitely encourage it because it's so life-changing, and I know it's changed my life, and I just feel so grateful that I found it, just like clowning found me, peer support found me, vice versa. But yeah, I think that the more we share our stories is just like you were saying earlier, that's how we're reducing the stigma, because that's what it took me first to see someone else who said, yeah, I've tried to end my life and I self-harmed. And I was like, oh my gosh, like I'm not the only one. There's someone who maybe won't judge me. And I think the more that we start to share, hey, here's, who I am, we're really building authenticity in our world. And I really value authenticity. So I think that that's what being a peer is about too, is just being your authentic self.